Tokyo. 12:15 in the morning, March 10, 1945. The air raid sirens finally sound across the eastern wards of the capital, and by the time anyone hears them, the bombs have already been falling for 7 minutes. 7 minutes does not sound like a long time. On this particular night, it is the difference between a city and a memory. Understand what has just failed, because the failure is not what you would assume. The men responsible for defending Tokyo were not asleep. They were not incompetent. They were not surprised in the way that word usually means. For 4 months, they had studied the problem of the American bomber with the seriousness of men who knew their families lived under the flight path. They had converted an entire flying regiment, the 53rd, into a specialist night fighter unit. They had put their pilots through a night training program so intense that it exhausted them. 6 nights earlier, on the 3rd and 4th of March, Japanese listening stations had intercepted American radio traffic that told them the enemy was practicing large-scale night flying. Their analysts drew exactly the right conclusion from it. Major night attacks were coming. They had picket boats at sea. They had radar stations on the coast. They had lookout posts. They had, by American intelligence estimates, more than 600 anti-aircraft guns ringing the capital and a searchlight regiment to feed them. They had 210 combat aircraft in the 10th Air Division. And they had something even better than equipment. They had evidence. On the 3rd of January, 97 American bombers had tried to burn Nagoya, and the Japanese had put those fires out. The lesson had been filed and circulated. Incendiary attack could be beaten. And on this night, none of it functions. The picket boats see the bombers and their radio reports do not get through. The radar stations are searching, diligently and correctly, at 30,000 feet, which is where the enemy has been for 106 consecutive days. The guns fire into the darkness, and their shells burst above and below the aircraft. 90 fighters go up, and not one of them brings a bomber down. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, roughly 279 American aircraft will operate over the most heavily defended city in the Japanese Empire, almost as if the defenses were not there at all. By morning, close to 16 square miles of Tokyo have ceased to exist. 267,000 buildings are gone. Over 1 million people are homeless, and the Japanese High Command is facing a question that it cannot answer with anything in its files. What, exactly, changed? Because that is the shape of the thing. Nothing new arrived over Tokyo that night. The aircraft were the same aircraft. The crews came from the same wings. The bases had not moved. The enemy did not unveil a weapon, and Japanese investigators looking for one found nothing, because there was nothing to find. So the explanations began. Imperial General Headquarters issued a communiqué stating that various places within the city had been set afire, which was true in the way that describing a drowning as contact with water is true. Within weeks, most of the senior officers of the 10th Air Division had been sacked or reassigned. Blame settled on men. Then it settled on spirit, on discipline, on the failure of civilians to fight fires with sufficient determination. Each of these answers had one thing in common. Each of them was looking for a person or a substance, and the answer was neither. The truth had no weight. It was not a device, and it was not a discovery, and it could not have been captured or reverse-engineered, because it consisted almost entirely of things being taken away, guns removed from aircraft, formation abandoned, altitude given up. The single most expensive weapons program in American history, more costly than the atomic bomb project, deliberately stripped of the features that made it famous and sent in low and blind and defenseless. Tonight we run the forensic audit on one of the strangest command failures of the Second World War. Not why Tokyo burned, which is well documented, but why the men whose entire professional life was the defense of that city could not identify what had beaten them, and why the answers they reached for made things worse. The answer is not a secret weapon. There was no secret weapon. The answer is stranger than that. And to find it we have to go back 4 years, to a factory in Kansas, a desert in Utah, and a wind that no one on Earth knew existed. Part 1. The problem of reach. Here is the difficulty that shaped the entire Pacific Air War, and it is so simple it is easy to walk past. Strategic bombing requires that you be able to reach the enemy. That is not a doctrine or a philosophy. It is arithmetic. In 1942, the United States possessed a vast and growing bomber force, the industrial capacity to multiply it, and crews being trained by the thousand. It also possessed no way whatsoever to attack the Japanese home islands in any sustained fashion, because the distances involved were beyond every aircraft it owned. The B-29 Flying Fortress, the machine that would batter Germany for 3 years, simply did not have the legs. Germany sat a few hundred miles from English airfields. Japan sat behind an ocean. The Doolittle raid of April 18, 1942, is remembered as an answer to that problem. It was not. It was proof the problem existed. 16 medium bombers flew a one-way mission from a carrier deck, did trivial damage, and could never be repeated. What it achieved was psychological, on both sides of the Pacific, and we will come back to the Japanese half of that reaction, because it produced one of the strangest wrong answers in the history of warfare. The solution the United States chose was not clever, it was enormous. If no existing aircraft could reach Japan, then a new aircraft would be built that could, and it would be built at a scale and speed that ignored every normal rule of engineering caution. The man who forced this through was General Henry Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces. Arnold's decision was to order the B-29 Superfortress into mass production before the testing program had established that it worked. In peacetime, this would have ended a career. Arnold did it anyway, and he did it knowing the numbers. The B-29 program consumed roughly $3 billion in wartime money. The Manhattan Project, which produced the atomic bomb, cost around $2 billion. The delivery aircraft cost more than the weapon, and the aircraft fought him. The B-29 was the most technically ambitious production aircraft of the war, and its problems were not small ones. Its Wright R-3350 engines ran hot, particularly in the rear cylinder banks, and they had a habit of catching fire in the air. On February 18, 1943, the second prototype suffered exactly that failure over Seattle. The pilot was Edmund Allen, known universally as Eddie Allen, and he was not an ordinary test pilot. He was widely considered the finest in the world, a quiet, methodical man whose presence at the controls was enough for insurance underwriters to lower their rates on an experimental flight. He could not save it. The aircraft came down into the Fry meatpacking plant south of downtown Seattle at lunchtime. Allen and all 10 men with him were killed, including 2 who jumped too low for their parachutes to open. So were around 20 workers inside the building, and a Seattle firefighter who died afterward from gas he breathed while fighting the blaze. Accounts of the total vary between roughly 29 and 32. Wartime censorship meant the public was never told what kind of aircraft had come down. Consider where that leaves the program. Its chief test pilot is dead. Its engines are burning. Its cost has passed the atomic bomb, and it has not flown a single combat mission. Arnold kept going and did something structurally strange that mattered enormously later. When the 20th Air Force was created to operate the B-29, he took personal command of it from Washington. This was unheard of. The bomber force answered to no theater commander in the Pacific, and Arnold owned every result it produced. He had made the gamble personal, and he would replace commanders without hesitation if it looked like failing. Now the specification, because everything that follows depends on it. The B-29 was pressurized, so its crews could operate above 30,000 feet without freezing. It carried remote-controlled gun turrets, aimed through an analog computer that corrected automatically for the aircraft's own motion, speed, and range. 4 engines of 2,200 horsepower each. It could carry roughly 9 tons of bombs. Nothing in the world compared to it, and nothing in Japanese service could climb to meet it at its working altitude. That last point is not a small one. In June to August of 1944, American forces took the Mariana Islands, and engineers immediately began building the airfields that put Tokyo within reach at last. The problem of reach was solved. Everyone understood what came next. Which brings us to the sentence that this entire video turns on, so hold it in your mind. The aircraft was never the weapon. The aircraft was the platform. The weapon was the decision about how to use it. Nobody in Japan believed that, because nobody in America believed it either. Not yet. For the next 4 months, the most advanced bomber ever built would fly over Japan and accomplish almost nothing. And the reason had nothing to do with courage, engineering, or numbers. It had to do with a river of air that no one had ever measured, and with an American commander who was about to be relieved of his command for failing to solve a problem he could not have known was there. Part 2. The Wind and the Pipe. There are two invisible things in this story. The Japanese defense could not have seen either of them, and neither could the Americans until they flew into one. The first was discovered by accident on the morning of November 1, 1944. At 5:55 that morning, an F-13 photographic reconnaissance aircraft, which was a B-29 stripped of bombs and filled with cameras, lifted off from Saipan. Its commander was Captain Ralph Steakley. His crew had arrived in the Marianas 2 days earlier after a 33-hour ferry flight from California, and the commander of the bomber force, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, had told them to rest. They refused and asked to fly over Japan immediately. The weather over Tokyo that day was perfect. As it turned out, November 1 would be the only day of the entire air campaign against Japan on which the home islands were completely free of cloud. Steakley crossed the city at 32,000 feet and ran his cameras over the aircraft and engine plants west of Tokyo, then went on to Nagoya. He brought back 7,000 photographs. Hansell would later call the flight probably the greatest single contribution to the air war with Japan. The Japanese response was immediate and completely ineffective. Fighters of the 47th Sentai began taking off at 1 in the afternoon. These were Nakajima Ki-44 fighters, and they had not been designed to operate at that height. They could not get closer than about 3,000 feet below the American aircraft. Two formations fired their machine guns anyway and hit nothing. Anti-aircraft batteries fired and hit nothing. Thousands of civilians in Tokyo watched all of it happen. It was the first American aircraft over the capital since the Doolittle raid 2.5 years before, and the failure to bring it down did more damage to public confidence than any bomb it could have carried. The crew named the aircraft Tokyo Rose the next day. But Steakley brought back something more important than the photographs, and he did not know what it was. He reported that he had encountered extraordinary winds. At times, his ground speed over Tokyo had dropped to roughly 70 miles per hour, in an aircraft cruising far faster than that. He had flown into the jet stream. In 1944, the American Air Forces did not know it existed. Now hold that, because here is what it did. When you release a bomb from 30,000 feet into a river of air moving at well over 100 miles per hour, the bomb does not fall where your bomb sight says it will. It is pushed. And the wind speeds at lower altitudes cannot be predicted from the wind speed at the top, so the correction cannot be computed. High-altitude precision bombing over Japan was not difficult. It was, in the strict sense, impossible. The second invisible thing was not a natural phenomenon, it was a piece of steel pipe. In the spring of 1943, the Chemical Warfare Service contracted the Standard Oil Development Company to build something in the Utah desert at a place called Dugway Proving Ground. What they built was a residential street, not a mock-up, a reproduction. The principal architect was Antonin Raymond, a Czech-born designer who had spent years building in Japan and knew the construction intimately. A specialist named Boris Laming, who had studied the fires that followed the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, contributed as well. The buildings used authentic light timber framing. The interiors were furnished with the tables, the bedding, the chests and the charcoal stoves that would be found in an ordinary Japanese home. Then, from May to September of 1943, the United States Army burned it down, over and over, rebuilding between tests, recording everything. The purpose was to find out which incendiary weapon worked best. The winner was a device with no glamour at all. The M69 was a hexagonal steel pipe about 20 inches long, weighing roughly 6 pounds, filled with gasoline thickened into a jelly by a chemistry team under Louis Fieser at Harvard. The world would come to know that jelly as napalm. The bomblet was designed to punch through a roof and lodge in the ceiling timbers, which is the most flammable part of a Japanese house. A fuse burned for 3 to 5 seconds. Then a small charge threw the burning filling as far as 100 feet in several flaming masses. One of these on its own is almost nothing. A man with a bucket can deal with one. They were never dropped on their own. They were carried in clusters of 38, and a single B-29 could carry 40 clusters, which is something over 1,500 individual bomblets from one aircraft. Now watch the pieces assemble, because this is the machine that the Japanese defense was actually facing, and not one component of it is a bomber. 7,000 photographs taken on the only clear day of the campaign. Analysts at the Office of Strategic Services grading districts of Tokyo by combustibility and identifying the most flammable ground in the city. An architect's professional knowledge of how Japanese houses are framed. A Utah desert street burned repeatedly until the correct weapon was identified. A weather phenomenon that made the intended method unworkable. And a 6-pound pipe manufactured in the tens of millions. Every part of that is unimpressive on its own. Assembled, it is a system for destroying a city. And the crucial point is that Japan could see exactly one element of it. The aircraft. Everything else was a document, a wind, a test result, or a decision, and none of those can be shot down. The system, though, came close to being abandoned before it was ever used properly. That is the part usually left out. The first raid on Tokyo from the Marianas came on November 24, 1944. It was given the code name San Antonio 1, and it was flown by the 73rd Bombardment Wing out of Isley Field on Saipan. 111 aircraft took off. The lead aircraft was named Dauntless Dottie and carried Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell in the pilot's seat, with Major Robert Morgan beside him as co-pilot, a man already famous for having commanded the B-17 Memphis Belle. 17 aircraft aborted with mechanical faults. Roughly 125 Japanese fighters came up, and of the entire force, somewhere between 24 and 35 aircraft managed to bomb the primary target, the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino. That the figure is still uncertain 80 years later tells you how confused the operation was. What is not uncertain is the result. Post-war assessment established the damage precisely. Around 1% of the plant's buildings and 2.4% of its machinery. 57 workers were killed. That is the result of sending the most expensive weapon system in history against a critical target, and it was not an unlucky day. It was the pattern. Attack after attack. Through December and January, the bombs went into the wrong fields. Cloud cover over Japan permitted, on average, about 7 clear days a month. The rest of the time, crews bombed by radar. Badly. In January 1945, Arnold relieved Haywood Hansell of command. Hansell was a genuine believer in precision bombing, an intelligent and principled officer, and he was fired for failing to achieve something the atmosphere itself would not permit. His replacement was Major General Curtis LeMay, brought over from the China-based Bomber Command, and LeMay understood his position perfectly. He had been given the job because his predecessor had failed. If he also failed, he would be replaced in turn. The last piece was an experiment that seemed to prove the wrong thing. On February 25, 1945, 231 aircraft were dispatched against Tokyo with incendiaries, of which 172 arrived. They bombed in daylight, in formation, from high altitude. Almost 28,000 buildings were destroyed. It was the most destructive raid yet flown against Japan, and LeMay's staff studied it and reached a conclusion that terrified everyone who heard it. The bombs, they concluded, had been dropped from far too high. Before we go into the night itself, one small thing. The men in this story on both sides, the reconnaissance crews, the ground engineers, the Tokyo firemen, are almost entirely absent from popular memory. If you think that is worth changing, the like button under this video is the single second of effort that puts this in front of more people. That is all it takes. By early March, LeMay had made a decision that his own intelligence officers believed would destroy his command, and he made it without asking permission. Part 3. 160 minutes. Begin with what LeMay actually decided, because the boldness of it is easy to lose in the aftermath. He would attack at night, because the weather over Japan was more favorable after dark, and the navigation systems his crews used worked better then. He would attack at low altitude, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, which was calculated to sit above the reach of light anti-aircraft guns and below the effective band of the heavy ones. He would send the aircraft individually rather than in formation, because formation flying is impossible in darkness, and because holding formation burns fuel, and then the decision that his crews hated. American intelligence had determined that Japan possessed only 2 night fighter units, and judged them a minor threat. So LeMay ordered the guns stripped out of the aircraft. Every turret except the tail position. The gunners stayed behind. Add the savings together, and each bomber could carry roughly twice its normal bomb load. His wing commanders agreed with the reasoning and were frightened by it anyway. His intelligence staff estimated that 70% of the force might be destroyed. LeMay consulted Arnold's chief of staff about the tactics but did not formally request approval, and he notified 20th Air Force headquarters on March 8, a day he knew Arnold would be absent. He said afterward that he had wanted to protect Arnold from the blame if it went wrong. He was also plainly protecting the plan from being stopped. He could not fly the mission himself. He had been briefed on the atomic bomb program and was therefore forbidden from putting himself where he could be captured. The raid was led by Brigadier General Thomas Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing. On the ground in the Marianas, mechanics worked a 36-hour shift to make ready every aircraft that could be made ready. Their normal serviceability rate was around 60%. That night they achieved 83. 346 aircraft were prepared. 325 were dispatched, beginning at 35 minutes past 5 in the afternoon on March 9, and it took 2 3/4 hours simply to get them all into the air. Now the ground they were flying toward, because the target selection was as deliberate as the tactics. The area designated Zone 1 was a rectangle in northeastern Tokyo, roughly 4 miles by 3. It straddled the Sumida River and covered most of the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards, part of the district known informally as Shitamachi, the Low City, home to working people and craftsmen. Around 1.1 million people lived inside it. It was among the most densely populated urban areas on Earth. It contained few large military factories. It contained an enormous number of small workshops feeding Japanese war production, and American planners knew that, and the orders issued to the crews said plainly that civilian casualties were part of the intended effect on production. There is no honest way to soften that sentence, and this video is not going to try. The area's vulnerability was not a secret to anyone. It had burned catastrophically after the earthquake of 1923. American intelligence rated it the most combustible ground in the city, and the Japanese authorities knew it too, which is why over 200,000 houses had already been pulled down to create fire breaks. The rubble from those demolitions had frequently not been cleared away, which meant the fire breaks were themselves stacked with fuel. Roughly 1.7 million people, mostly children and those in non-essential work, had already left Tokyo. For those who stayed, shelter provision was almost non-existent. Most households had dug a crude hole near the house. Now the defense, which is the heart of the matter, and the reason the Japanese command could not identify what had happened. The 10th Air Division held around 210 combat aircraft, and the great majority of them were day fighters. The 53rd Air Regiment, the specialist night unit, had 25 or 26 aircraft, and was still struggling with the conversion. The 1st Anti-Aircraft Division controlled the guns across central Honshu, 8 regiments and around 780 pieces, with a searchlight regiment attached. American estimates put something over 600 guns around Tokyo itself. Every element of that was configured for one thing, a daylight formation at 30,000 feet. The Japanese had guessed correctly that night raids were coming. What they had not imagined, and had no reason to imagine, was that anyone would bring a 4-engine bomber over a defended capital at 7,000 feet. The first aircraft over the city, shortly before midnight, were 4 Pathfinders carrying no bombs, only extra fuel, extra radios and the best radio operators in the command, circling at 25,000 feet to control the raid. It did not work, and was later judged unnecessary. It is the one part of the plan that failed, and nobody noticed. At 8 minutes past midnight, the attack began. Pathfinder bombers ran in at right angles to one another and laid M47 napalm bombs in a burning cross over the target area. Every following wing and group had been briefed to bomb a different sector inside that cross. At 15 minutes past midnight, the alarm sounded in Tokyo. Understand what had gone wrong in those 7 minutes, because it is a failure of expectation rather than equipment. The picket boats had seen the force coming. Poor radio reception meant most of their reports never arrived, and disorganization in the defense commands meant that the fragments which did arrive were not acted on. Around midnight, a small number of aircraft had been detected near Katsuura and were assumed to be reconnaissance, because reconnaissance was what small numbers of aircraft meant. Later sightings of bombers flying low were not taken seriously, and the radar operators went on searching the altitude band where the enemy had always been. The guns opened fire and could not solve the problem. Their fire control equipment was unsophisticated, and their radar had short range, and against aircraft at an altitude nobody had planned for, their shells burst above the bombers or below them. Crews reported heavy anti-aircraft fire, and the fire slackened as the night went on because the gun positions themselves were being overrun by the fires. The fighters achieved nothing whatsoever. They received no guidance from the radar stations. Their efforts and the gunners' efforts were never coordinated. Across the entire raid, American crews reported seeing Japanese fighters 76 times and being attacked 40 times, and not one bomber was brought down by a fighter. Several Japanese pilots died when their aircraft ran out of fuel. The guns did better than that. Japanese gunners shot down 12 aircraft and damaged 42. 2 of the damaged machines were written off afterward, which brings the total loss to 14. 96 American airmen were killed or missing. 5 crews ditched in the sea and were picked up by American submarines. Against a predicted 70% loss rate, the actual figure was around 4%. On the ground, the situation moved beyond control almost immediately. Tokyo's fire service consisted of about 8,000 firemen across 287 stations, with little modern equipment and with tactics that were simply ineffective against this weapon. Civilians had been organized into over 140,000 neighborhood firefighting associations with a nominal strength of 2.75 million people, and the basic equipment those groups had been issued could not put out an M69. Within 30 minutes, the fire department had lost control. Within an hour, it stopped trying to fight the fires and switched entirely to guiding people out and pulling them from buildings. Over 125 firemen and 500 civil guards assigned to help them were killed. 96 fire engines were destroyed. The wind that night was the final variable, and it belonged to nobody's plan. Gusts of between 45 and 67 miles per hour were blowing from the southeast. Thousands of small fires merged, and the merged fires became firestorms that moved northwest across the district. Here is the tragedy inside the tragedy, and it is the detail that has haunted Japanese writing about that night ever since. Japanese civil defense doctrine instructed civilians to remain at their homes and fight fires. It was a doctrine built around the isolated incendiary, the one bomb in the roof and the bucket of sand. On the night of March 10, it was lethal advice. The historian Richard Frank put the matter in a single line, that the key to survival was to grasp quickly that the situation was hopeless and flee. Broadcasts began telling people to evacuate soon after the raid began. Not everyone believed them, because they contradicted everything the government had told them for 2 years. The raid lasted about 2 hours and 40 minutes. Smoke reduced visibility so much that later aircraft bombed outside the target area, and the heat generated turbulence severe enough to throw the final waves around the sky. Thomas Power circled above it for 90 minutes with a team of cartographers mapping the spread of the fires in real time, which tells you as much about the American conception of this operation as any document. It was being measured while it happened. The aircraft landed back in the Marianas between 6:10 and 27 minutes past 11 that morning, their surfaces streaked with ash. The casualty figures have never been settled, and any script that gives you one confident number is lying to you. 79,466 bodies were recovered and recorded. Tokyo's Director of Health estimated 83,600 killed. The official figure entered in the American Mission Report was 83,793. The Tokyo Fire Department put it at 97,000. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded 87,793 killed and just under 41,000 injured, and stated that most of the dead were women, children, and the elderly. Historians generally work with a figure between 90,000 and 100,000, and some argue for considerably higher. The Tokyo Memorial Hall honors 105,400. The reason the number cannot be fixed is itself part of the story. Entire communities died together, records burned with the offices that held them, and hundreds of thousands of people had moved into and out of the city in the preceding months. 267,171 buildings were destroyed, a quarter of every building in Tokyo. 1,008,005 people were made homeless by that single night. 15.8 square miles were burned out. Now put yourself, honestly, inside the Kanto air defense sector that night, because those officers are the subject of our title. You were not caught unprepared. You had predicted night attack and prepared for night attack. Your radar searched where the enemy had always been and found nothing there. Your guns were laid for a height the enemy did not use. Your fighters flew into a sky they could not be directed through. Your civil defense system executed its doctrine correctly, and its doctrine killed people. Every single thing you had built worked exactly as designed, against an attack that no longer existed. They were not outfought. The defense of Tokyo was never defeated. It was made irrelevant, in 160 minutes, by a set of decisions taken 3,000 miles away about what to leave behind. Part 4. Looking for a weapon. The Japanese response began with denial and moved rapidly into something more revealing. The Imperial General Headquarters communique of March 10 stated that various places within the city had been set afire. Rumors of the truth were across the country within days regardless. Then the government did something it had never done before. Instead of minimizing the damage, it encouraged newspapers to publicize the scale of it, hoping to convert horror into anger against the United States. The attack was on the front page of every Japanese paper on March 11. Coverage emphasized the immorality of the raid and the number of American aircraft destroyed. Radio Tokyo called it slaughter bombing. Subsequent reporting quietly stopped mentioning casualties, and the photographs that ran showed remarkably little damage. Then came the accountability, and it went in precisely the wrong direction. The majority of the 10th Air Division's senior officers were sacked or reassigned. 20 aircraft were sent to reinforce the division, and when no further attack on the capital came within a fortnight, those aircraft were transferred somewhere else. Look at what that response assumes. It assumes the failure was one of personnel and effort. Replace the officers, add some aircraft, exhort the population to firefight harder. Alongside it came repression, with heavy penalties for anyone accused of spreading rumors and propaganda intended to restore confidence in the country's air and civil defenses. It did not work, for the obvious reason that the public had just watched those defenses fail. The available categories were spirit, discipline, sabotage, and betrayal. There was no category for a foreign commander changing 3 variables on a briefing sheet. There is one more reaction worth recording, at the very top, and it has to be handled carefully, because historians do not agree about it. On March 18, 8 days after the raid, the Emperor toured the burned districts. What that visit did to him is genuinely disputed. Some historians argue it convinced him the war was lost. Others argue it changed nothing, and point out that he went on supporting the continuation of the war into the middle of that year. What is not disputed is that he had already been told. On February 14, 3 weeks before the raid, Prince Fumimaro Konoe had presented him with a written memorial, stating flatly that defeat was inevitable and urging that the war be ended. Konoe was the only senior statesman consulted who said so. Every other one advised carrying on, and the advice was set aside in favor of seeking one more victory first. Whatever March 10 did or did not do to the emperor, the conclusion had reached the top of the Japanese state a month before Tokyo burned. The professionals below him did better, halfway. The realization spread that firebombing had been catastrophically underestimated, and the improvement showed. Nagoya was attacked on the night of March 11, Osaka in the early hours of March 14, Kobe on the 17th and 18th, Nagoya again on the 18th and 19th. Each of those raids killed fewer than 10,000 people. That is a horrifying sentence to write as evidence of success, but it is what better preparation brought, and the credit belongs to Japanese civil authorities who learned faster than their military did. What never improved was the military answer. The Japanese armed forces never developed an adequate night air defense. From April, the policy became to reduce interception attempts altogether in order to preserve aircraft for the invasion everyone expected. Many cities went without anti-aircraft guns entirely. The defense of the home islands was, in effect, given up in order to be saved for later. And here is where the story turns strange, because Japan had already designed its own answer to the American bomber, and it was built on the exact same discovery. Remember Steakley's report of a wind at 30,000 feet? Japanese meteorologists had known about that wind for years. Their own researchers had studied high-altitude winds over Japan back in the 1920s, and they understood its seasonal behavior better than anyone in the United States did. And after the Doolittle raid, when the Japanese High Command went looking for a way to strike the American mainland, they went to the wind. The result was Operation Fugo. Hydrogen balloons, roughly 33 feet across, built largely from paper made from the bark of the kozo tree, assembled in significant part by conscripted schoolgirls who were never told what they were making. Each carried incendiaries and a high explosive charge, along with an automatic ballast system to hold altitude across the Pacific. They would ride the jet stream 5,000 miles from the Japanese coast to North America. The first was launched on November 3, 1944, a date chosen because it was the birthday of the Emperor Meiji. Around 9,300 were released in total, and researchers estimate that only about 1 in 10 ever reached the continent. Now compare the two uses of the same discovery. One side found the wind, understood it as an obstacle to the method it had chosen, and abandoned the method. The other side found the wind, understood it as an opportunity, and committed years of production to it. Japan's answer to the strategic bombing problem was a weapon that could not be aimed, could not be observed, and could not be adjusted. It was a leaflet with a bomb attached. The results are quickly told. Balloons came down across Alaska, Canada, and the western United States. The American reaction was a voluntary press blackout, which worked, because the Japanese had no way of learning what their weapon had achieved, and eventually concluded it had achieved nothing. The campaign was halted in April 1945. It killed 6 people, on May 5, 1945, near the town of Bly in Oregon. They were the only people killed by enemy attack in the continental United States during the entire war, and they deserve to be named rather than counted, so we will come back to them at the end. There is one part of the balloon story that belongs in this audit for a different reason. When the first balloons were recovered, American authorities had no idea where they were coming from. Submarines was one theory. Saboteurs already inside the United States was another. The question was answered by geologists. The Military Geology Unit of the United States Geological Survey took the sand from the ballast bags and examined the microscopic fossils and living organisms inside it. A researcher named Clarence Ross matched the grains to specific stretches of the Japanese coast, and one of the beaches he identified turned out to be an actual launch site. Sit with that comparison for a moment, because it is the whole war in a single image. One side hoped that a wind would carry a paper balloon to a target it could never see. The other side responded by reading a handful of sand. By the end of the campaign, the tally is stark. Firebombing raids of the kind flown on March 10 ultimately burned out around 66 Japanese cities, and some accounts put the figure higher. The attacks on Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe during March alone destroyed over 31 square miles. And crucially, the March raids stopped only when the American command ran out of incendiary bombs. Notice the layers, because they explain why no counter existed. Suppose Japan had somehow closed the low-altitude gap in its defenses. Beneath the tactics sat the photographs, and beneath the photographs sat the test data from Utah, and beneath that sat a weapon so cheap it was produced in the tens of millions. The aircraft was one visible layer of something that was mostly paper. The final irony is not a comfortable one, and it belongs in an honest account. The technique of burning a wooden Asian city from the air was not invented over Tokyo. Japan had conducted sustained area bombing against Chinese cities throughout the war, most notoriously against Chongqing, where the explicit purpose was to terrorize a civilian population. The method that destroyed Shitamachi in 1945 was not new to the war. It was new to Japan. Before the last chapter, the part of this channel that matters most. If your father or grandfather flew with the 20th Air Force, serviced those engines in the Marianas, or worked as a photo interpreter, or if your family lived through the raids on the other side of it, I would be honored to read about them in the comments. Which unit, which island, which ward of the city? Those details do not survive in archives. They survive in families, and only while somebody is still asking. Because the last scene in this story is not a battle, it is an administrative decision, and it is more devastating than any of them. Part 5. The verdict. Tokyo was attacked with incendiaries several more times through the spring of 1945. The final such raid came on the night of May 25 and 26. After it, the American command performed an assessment and concluded that further heavy bomber raids on Tokyo were not worthwhile. Slightly over half of the city had been destroyed. Across all the raids together, more than 4 million people had been driven from their homes. There was not enough remaining to justify the fuel. Tokyo was removed from the target list. Consider that as the ending, because it is the precise inverse of a victory. Everything Japan had built to protect the capital saved none of it. Tokyo came off the list because there was nothing left worth burning. The attacks did stop, eventually, for reasons that had nothing whatever to do with the defense. So let us close the case, and answer the question in the title plainly. First, a word about that question, because precision matters here. What happened inside the Japanese High Command was not hysteria. Nobody ran through the corridors. The response was bureaucratic, and that is exactly what makes it worth studying. A minimizing communique, a reversal of press policy, a round of dismissals. The behavior of an institution that has been hit by something it cannot name and reaches for the nearest available handle. And it did not begin because bombers had reached Tokyo. Bombers had been reaching Tokyo since November 24, 1944, and for 4 months the experience had been almost reassuring. The bombers came in daylight, in tight formations, from 30,000 feet, and they missed. Japanese fighters could not climb to them, but Japanese cities were surviving. There was even evidence, from Nagoya in January, that fires could be contained. A model had formed, and the model was working. It broke in a single night. Here is the reversal the whole story turns on. From inside the Kanto air defense sector, a change of tactics looked exactly like a new weapon. That is why the search went where it did. A veteran air defense officer carries a working picture of what a raid is, built from 4 months of consistent evidence, and human beings do not treat that as a habit. They treat it as a property of the enemy. When the enemy stops having that property, the mind does not conclude that a general changed his mind. It concludes that something has been introduced. So the investigation looks for a device, finds none, then looks for someone to blame, and finds several. The cause was never among the visible things. It was a decision to fly at night, a decision to fly low, a decision to fly alone, a decision to take out the guns. None of those has a serial number. Run the final numbers, both ways. On the American side, the March 10 raid cost 14 aircraft and 96 airmen, against an internal prediction that 70% of the force would be lost. Across the whole program, the B-29 consumed $3 billion, more than the atomic bomb project it eventually delivered, and it killed its own chief test pilot and roughly 30 other people in Seattle before it ever saw combat. On the Japanese side, the decisive figure is the one nobody can supply. The dead of that night cannot be counted, because the record burned along with the people in it. And the verdict is this: Japan built its defenses against an aircraft. The aircraft was never the decision. Some of these people lived long enough to be worth following. Ralph Steakley received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the flight of November 1, and his photographs were still being used at the end of the war. Haywood Hansell, relieved of command in January 1945 for a failure the atmosphere had imposed on him, went on to write one of the most thoughtful memoirs of the strategic air war, and it is his judgment that gave Steakley his best epitaph. Curtis LeMay commanded the American Strategic Air Forces into the Cold War and died in 1990. In December of 1964, the year Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games, the Japanese government awarded him one of its highest decorations, the Order of the Rising Sun, First Class, for his help in building Japan's post-war air self-defense force. Elsie Mitchell, who was 26 years old and 5 months pregnant, and 5 children, Dick Patsky, aged 14, Jay Gifford, aged 13, Edward Engen, aged 13, Joan Patsky, aged 13, and Sherman Shoemaker, aged 11, were killed by a Fugo balloon on a mountainside near Bly, Oregon, on May 5, 1945. Elsie's husband Archie, a pastor, had stopped the car to park it and was the only one of the group who survived. They were killed by a paper balloon, riding the same wind that had made high-altitude bombing of Japan impossible. And Katsumoto Saotome was 12 years old on the night of March 10, mobilized out of school to collect scrap metal for munitions, and he ran through the burning district with his family and survived. He became a writer. In June of 1967, he read a newspaper report about human remains found in a buried air raid shelter during subway construction in Fukagawa, and it changed the direction of his life. He began interviewing survivors, most of whom initially refused to speak to him. In 1971, he published their accounts, modelled on John Hersey's account of Hiroshima, and it sold over 500,000 copies. He spent about 30 years trying to obtain public funding for a museum and never got it. In 2002, he built one anyway with private money, the center of the Tokyo raids and war damage, in eastern Tokyo. He refused the easy version of where responsibility lay. He said the United States should bear responsibility, and that, first of all, the Japanese government should answer for starting the war. He died in May of 2022 at the age of 90. Official Japanese commemoration has always been quiet. The academic Kerry Caracas argues this is partly because acknowledging March 10 means acknowledging that Japan conducted the first air raids on Asian cities, which complicates a simpler story. March 10 was designated Tokyo Peace Day in 1990, and a Buddhist service has been held every year since 1951. One more thing, and then we are done. Every defense doctrine written since that night assumes the enemy will one day do the thing he has never done before. That is the professional inheritance of March 10, and it was bought at a price nobody has ever been able to count. But the people inside it were not variables in a targeting study. They had names: Steakley, Allen, Hansel, Power, Sautome, the Mitchell family and the children who went on that picnic, the 125 firemen of Tokyo who kept working until the fires took them, whose names are not in any English language account of this raid and should be. If this audit gave you something to think about, the like button helps it reach people who want the history done properly rather than tidily. Subscribe if you want the next one. And remember what this story actually proves. By 1945, war had become a contest of assumptions. The side that guessed right about what the enemy would never try won the night, and everybody underneath it paid for the guess.